In class, we covered the horrific stalemate on the Western Front during the First World War. By 1915, a vast network of trenches stretched from the English Channel in the north to the Swiss Alps in the south. Some were better dug than others, with wooden planks to keep out the mud and with barbed wire to stall any attempted enemy advance. Others were little more than holes in the ground, filled with dirt, grime, and vomit. To step over the trench was to invite near certain death. Each side was separated by territory called no man's land, with sharpshooters constantly on the lookout for any available target. But with no end in sight, some soldiers began to take matters into their own hands. Many purposely sought to be wounded, preferably in the hand, which necessitated a long recovery and was not life-threatening. In France, so many troops were doing this by 1917 that the practice was formally outlawed, and anyone who was wounded in the hand, purposely or not, was suspect. Those found guilty of self-mutilation were sentenced to no man's land, meaning that they were forced to abandon their trench and climb over the top, with no food or water. If you somehow survived, then your sentence might be commuted to life imprisonment, but most died within minutes, falling victim to enemy shells or bullets. As the war ground on, both sides sought some means of gaining an advantage. The Royal Navy had imposed a naval blockade on the North Sea, cutting Germany off from most overseas commerce. To combat this menace, the Germans placed their hope in a new submarine corps, in which German U-boats would steam below the surface of the ocean and attack enemy vessels. Though ships flying the flag of belligerent countries were always fair game, the Germans sought to replicate Britain's naval blockade by attacking any ship trading with Britain or France, regardless of whether they flew the flag of a belligerent power. In practice, this meant attacking American ships, a dangerous move. Though the U.S. would eventually enter the war on the side of the Allies, in 1914 American opinion was sharply divided. German immigrants were a sizable voting bloc, especially in the Midwest, and there were some who hoped that America would enter the war on the side of Germany. Anheuser-Busch, for instance, bought $1 million worth of German war bonds. This decision would later haunt the company. In 1917, prohibitionists attacked Budweiser drinkers as disloyal and secured enough votes to add beer to its list of intoxicating substances, which would then be banned by the 18th Amendment. But most Americans in 1914 wanted to remain neutral, seeing no reason why a European war was any of their concern. This would have remained so were it not for German attacks on American shipping. In May 1915, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania, a passenger liner carrying nearly 200 Americans. More than half died, prompting outrage across the U.S. Many Americans demanded that Germany be punished, and it was only when the Kaiser apologized and promised not to attack Americans that tensions died down. In 1916, the situation had calmed enough for the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to win re-election on a peace platform, having boasted to the American people that he had kept them out of the war. But by the spring of 1917, Germany was growing desperate. Faced with low morale and dwindling supplies, the Navy resumed its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Dozens of American ships were sunk in the North Atlantic. German war planners knew that this would bring America into the conflict, but they hoped to gain enough of an advantage that they could defeat France and Britain before the U.S. could fully mobilize. And to keep Americans occupied, the German High Command transmitted the infamous Zimmermann telegram to Mexico, promising the Mexican government that if it invaded the American Southwest on Germany's behalf, all territories lost in the Mexican-American War of the previous century would be restored. On April 6, 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war on Germany. From the beginning, though, Americans insisted that their war aims were different. Woodrow Wilson pledged that this would be the war to end all wars, and that he was making the world safe for democracy. And to demonstrate this, he released a 14-point plan for peace, pledging to respect national self-determination, to allow open trade and navigation on the seas, and urging the creation of a League of Nations, that would work to prevent any future wars through the principle of collective security. This would serve as the basis for the subsequent peace in Europe, though as we'll see, it didn't quite work as intended. To forestall the inevitable arrival of American troops on the Western Front, the German army readied for one last offensive against their allied foes. At this point, they were fighting a one-front war. The now communist Russians had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ceded a huge swath of the former Russian Empire to a greater Germany. Troops that had been on the Eastern Front were rushed to France, and in late March 1918, the Germans began their spring offensive. German troops were commanded by Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, the victors at Tannenberg, who by 1916 had largely sidelined the Kaiser and governed Germany as a military dictatorship. The offensive was at first successful. The German army broke through Allied lines and raced toward Paris, but it was stopped not far from where it had been stopped in 1914. This second Battle of the Marne was more devastating than the first. Indeed, German morale never recovered. By the autumn of 1918, German troops were in retreat across the whole Western Front, which was now bolstered by hundreds of thousands of freshly arrived American doughboys. Seeing the writing on the wall, Hindenburg and Ludendorff urged the Kaiser to resign. He did so on November 9th, and in his stead emerged a German provisional government led by the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. That provisional government asked for an armistice based on Wilson's 14 points, which came into effect 2 days later, on November 11, 1918. World War I, then of course known as the Great War, was over. But the seeds of a future war were already being laid in this tumultuous moment. By urging the Kaiser to resign and placing the responsibility for peace on the SPD-led provisional government, the German High Command absolved themselves of any role in this defeat, even though they well knew that Germany had been defeated. Since there were Jews among the SPD leadership, this helped foster the myth that Germany was actually winning the war, but had been stabbed in the back by Jews and socialists. And to the average soldier, it was far from obvious that Germany had actually been defeated. After all, German troops were still fighting on foreign soil when the armistice was declared. Many thought the war had actually ended in a stalemate, and that the subsequent peace would reflect this. When German troops returned home, they were greeted as conquering heroes, sentiments encouraged by the nation's new democratic government. Germany's new president, Friedrich Ebert, even oversaw a military parade, reminding the soldiers present that, quote, "No enemy has prevailed over you. You have protected the homeland from the enemy's invasion. You have saved your women and children and your parents from the murder and fire of war. You have saved Germany's fields and workshops from devastation and destruction. For that, we at home thank you from the very depths of our being." So when the German delegation traveled to Paris the following year for the Versailles Peace Conference, they expected to have an equal seat at the table. They were in for a rude awakening. The U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived at the peace conference brimming with ideas. He would break up the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, creating a number of small nation-states from its wreckage. These included the new country of Czechoslovakia, but as this example would demonstrate, Wilson merely reshaped the nationalities question in Eastern Europe. He didn't solve it. Czechoslovakia contained a substantial German minority in the Sudetenland, a group that traded its privileged position in the Austrian Empire with a decidedly non-privileged one in the Czech nation-state. Though the Czech government offered plenty of concessions to its German minority, most Sudeten Germans thought of themselves as German, not Czech, and wanted to merge with Germany. This would have accorded with Wilson's principle of self-determination, but the Allies had no intention of enlarging Germany's borders after 4 years of war. As an example, the new nations in Eastern Europe included a rump Austrian state, which contained most of the former empire's German-speaking minority, and it was expressly forbidden from merging with Germany itself. As this example demonstrates, national self-determination would in general come at Germany's expense. A new Polish nation-state was created in 1919. Poland had once been a powerful kingdom in Eastern Europe, but in the late 18th century it was carved up between Prussia, Russia, and Austria. Polish nationalists kept their identity alive, and a Polish state re-emerged from the devastation of World War I. It was made up of Polish-speaking areas carved from all three former empires, but since the Allies believed that Poland would remain forever impoverished without a seaport, they granted Poland a corridor to the sea through formerly German territory. This separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Allies also created the Free City of Danzig, separating German-speaking Danzig, the main port on the Baltic, from the rest of Germany, and granting the Poles special rights there. All of these issues would be condemned by German nationalists as unfair and repressive, and would play a major role in Hitler's rise to power. Woodrow Wilson thought that these initiatives would remake Europe and bring peace to a shattered continent. But the other Allied leaders at Versailles had more traditional aims. They agreed to Wilson's proposal to create a League of Nations, but this organization was powerless from the start. Neither Germany nor Russia, soon to be reorganized into the Soviet Union, were allowed to join, while isolationist opinion in America itself prevented the US from joining too. As a result, the League would never provide the collective security Wilson craved. The French president, Georges Clemenceau, wanted to punish Germany for its aggression, hoping thereby to prevent Germany from ever again threatening France. Commenting on the population imbalance between the two countries, Clemenceau famously remarked that there were 20 million Germans too many. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was less vindictive, but he too believed that Germany should bear the burden of defeat. In the end, the Allies agreed that Germany should pay 132 billion Deutschmarks in reparations for the damage inflicted by the war. This would bankrupt the already devastated German economy in the immediate post-war years, and in fact, Germany paid its last installment in 2011. Additionally, the Germans would also be forced to admit full responsibility for provoking the war. This was the infamous war guilt clause, which underpinned the justification for reparations. Germany would be obliged to allow France to occupy the Rhineland as a buffer zone and to cede Alsace-Lorraine back to France. And it would also pledge to demilitarize. Germany was permitted an army of no more than 100,000 men and no navy or air force. This was all incredibly humiliating for the German delegation at Versailles, but the Allies threatened to resume the war if they refused such terms. With Germany in no position to resist, its delegation signed the peace treaty in the summer of 1919. The war was over, but the seeds of another one were just beginning.